Greetings all, and welcome to the second part of the 20th episode of the V.T.P, or the Veteran Trainer's Perspective. We're only halfway through the list of original Japanese Pokemon names that I think deserve analysis, so let's not waste any more time and get right back into the thick of things.
Luxray is definitely one of the more majestic looking Pokemon out there, but while its original name might have solid connections to its appearance, it is also linked to one of its special abilities. While its name contains the Japanese word for tiger, it is also a reference to Wilhelm Röntgen, the man who originally discovered and studied X-rays. This links with Luxray's ability to actually see through walls, a clever nod to how X-rays allow us to see what is beneath the surface of the skin for practical and medical purposes. Spiritomb have one of the more unique naming conventions, as their original Japanese name doesn't actually reference their spectral forms at all. Rather, the name is a direct reference to the odd keystone they are bound to. Within Spiritomb's Japanese name, we have the Japanese word for jar or urn, which hints towards the odd keystone acting as a container for the numerous souls bound to it, and the words for either pumice or granite, which likely speaks to the actual type of rock the old keystone is made out of. Given the fact that Spiritomb tend to weigh a great deal, I'm going to go with the latter option, though it is still funny regardless that their true original names speak almost nothing about what they are or how they came to be. Lucario's name is a bit of a mess in terms of translation meaning, as there are many possible components that may go into the structure of their name, which is the same in both English and Japanese. On the one hand, it may contain references to the mythical metal orichalcum or even oracle, representing the steel-type attributes and the aura powers, respectively, but it also can possibly have components that reference a specific type of real-world canine, the city of Cairo, Pharaoh, or even Lycos, the Greek word for wolf. None of these seem out of place in their design and powers, so it might just be a case where the name says many things about them, helping to flesh out their design and give greater meaning to it than might be apparent at first glance. When it comes to the legendary lake trio of Uxie, Mesprit, and Azelf, the naming conventions of the first two are relatively easy to understand, but Azelf's original Japanese name is a bit on the quirky side in regards to the words that form it. For one thing, part of its name comes from the Greek word for agnosticism. This is a bit ironic though, given that the key tenet of this sort of ideology is that there is no way to prove that God does or does not exist, Azelf being something that could basically be classified as a god, but made likely to represent the idea in this ideology that human willpower is the true commanding force of one's purpose in life. The other funny thing is that the other part of their original name is a reference to gnomes. Given that Uxie is named after pixies and Mesprit sprites, it makes sense that Azelf would similarly be named after some sort of mythical creature, but why a gnome was picked is not entirely clear, though Azelf's representation of willpower might suggest that this is a reference to the simple, down-to-earth existence of willpower as a force in pretty much any living creature. Palkia's name, which is the same for almost all languages, hides a bit of a secret reference in it that might not be apparent at first glance. While it can be easily seen that this creature's name contains part of the word Pearl, which matches up with the game version it took center stage in initially, the other half is also a reference to the word alkali. While this might not seem to have much of a connection at first, alkalis are salts typically present in a solid state that dissolve in water, which would harken back to its water-type assignment, though why alkali itself was picked over a similar term is not completely apparent. Despite Giratina having the same name in English and Japanese, the name itself has a lot of hidden references that help to cement this creature and the worlds it occupies. The name Giratina is derived from a few sources, including Girasol, a type of red opal, linking it to the red claws on the tips of its wings, Giraer, which is the Italian word to mean to wander or turn around, which is a great nod to its renegade status, going as it pleases in the real world and distortion world, unlike its contemporaries in many cases, and chief among them all, the Japanese word for platinum, which, well, the reference is very obvious in hindsight, given that it truly stepped into the spotlight with the release of Pokémon Platinum. Okay, now as much as I love Darkrai and still think it is one of the best designed Pokémon to ever be created, I must poke a bit of fun at its name, as it is basically just a double word. First of all, of course, its name, which is the same across nearly all languages, is derived from the word dark, which makes sense both in terms of its appearance and behavior. However, the other part of its name is specifically derived from the Japanese word for dark. So, in essence, Darkrai's name sort of translates to dark, dark. I find this to be a bit on the funny side, but given that it is known as the Pitch Black Pokémon and is all but synonymous with darkness in the franchise today, the double pairing of words makes for a fitting title. The members of the Panpour family might not seem to have names that are all that odd or in need of explanation, but I think there is something to be said about the Japanese names and the moves they can actually learn. On the one hand, their names are derived from Japanese words and phrases like ape and cool water, which doesn't seem so odd at first glance. However, these creatures at the time of the debut in Generation 5 were the only Pokemon that could naturally learn the Scald attack, and to me, that is somewhat funny given that their names are meant to symbolize cool water rather than hot. Tranquill are a little on the odd side with the Japanese names, as they seem to reference their behavior and Pokédex entries more than some others. For Tranquill, the Japanese name contains references that translate to words for pigeon and escape, hinting towards their tendency to escape and not fight others if confronted, but also may be a hint towards the fictional worlds of Kenji Miyazawa, linked to the place that Tranquill are said to dwell, where there is nothing but peace and no strife or conflict. I don't know about you, but I wouldn't mind living in such a place if it ever became possible. Roggenrola's original Japanese name is a bit of a funny one, as it is more of an indirect reference to their form rather than something more direct. In essence, their name is derived from the word for grounder, but also a Japanese dumpling, which is cute and oddly specific, likely referencing their odd semi-spherical shape. At the same time, its name may also be a bit of a reference to the sound of a rolling boulder, which once again comes down to their semi-spherical shape. A bit of an odd thing to name it from, at least as far as dumplings go, but it seems to make at least some sense in hindsight. Sewaddle's name stands out a bit from the evolutions in that it actually references something in real life that makes more sense for inclusion than one might initially think. In truth, Sewaddle's original Japanese name is derived from one of two possible words, either the word for the phrase to wrap up, or the word for walnut tree. The former of these options makes sense given their leaf-wrapped forms, but the other is a bit perplexing, until one takes a close look at the leaf on their head. Though there are bite marks on it, it very clearly has the outline of a walnut tree leaf, helping to make the two possible translations almost interchangeable in the context of their name. Carracosta might not look to be the most dangerous of creatures at first glance, but these massive turtles are known for being a severe menace when hunting and fighting, and this is uniquely demonstrated in their original name. While Carracosta's Japanese name contains the words for shell and ribcage, both referencing their unique skeletal anatomy, it also contains a word that means to thrash or act violently, which, given their Pokédex entries, is a nice nod to how vicious their otherwise placid forms can be. While the members of the Psilocys family are abnormal in the way that their bodies are formed in the first place, it really gets taken home when you take a look at Reuniclus' Japanese name. On the one hand, it contains part of the Japanese word for either disorder or spawn, which may be a reference to the fact that they do resemble a simple and somewhat awkwardly formed multicellular organism, and in turn are a spawn of a primitive creature. On the other hand, though, it also has a clear reference to homunculus in their name, which describes a fully formed humanoid of some sort. This makes sense given the fact that their frames suddenly develop humanoid arms when they evolve from Duosion, even though they are supposed to represent a simple organism you'd be more likely to find with a microscope than you would your own plain vision. Escavalier is an interesting case, where its Japanese name does seem to match its form quite well, but is also quite interesting in how it references its own requirements for evolution. In essence, the Japanese name for this creature is derived from the words for night, which fits, and snail, which they do admittedly look like a bit, but that is only really because they are inhabiting the shell material of a shellmet in evolution. They aren't truly snails in a biological sense, but this is a nice reference to what is needed in order for them to evolve from Karrablast in the first place. Elgyem's name is unique in that it references not something that is specific to any particular culture, but instead a global icon of sorts. These creatures in lore are heavily hinted at being extraterrestrial in origin, and their original Japanese name reflects this, being an altered form of the word gray, the Greys being the classic and most well-represented type of alien in real-life alien stories. The name may even be taken from the adage, little green men, another classic reference to aliens in popular culture that makes it pretty clear that these creatures are likely intended to not be of this world, though from where, no one can really say. Accelgor might seem to have a ninja-like form that would likely lead many to assume there is a reference going on with its design, but the truth is actually much more interesting and unique. The Japanese name for this creature comes from the Japanese words for agile and rider. Agile makes perfect sense given their incredible speed, but how does the other one make any sense? Well, the odd thing is that it's most likely a reference to Kamen Rider, and the connection becomes even more apparent because the scarf-like wrapping that flows back past the main body is a direct reference to the Showa era of Kamen Rider, where such a scarf was common as it was a more stylized and less cumbersome substitute for a cape. Golurk seemingly has a Japanese name that is pretty basic and easy to understand on paper, but its implications are a bit more on the spooky side. Golurk's original Japanese name is derived from the Japanese words for golem and cyborg. While the former note is pretty cut and dry and needs no explanation, the inclusion of cyborg is odd, as a cyborg by definition means that while some parts of its form are mechanical, they are there to assist actual living tissue of some sort. This seemingly implies that there is something organic going on with Golurk, and while it might not seem so outwards, there is a good chance that this is a strong hint towards their spiritual essence and ghost-type attributes. Frogadier's Japanese name is one that I admittedly do not fully understand and cannot provide great context on, sadly. While it is easy to see that their name contains the Japanese word for the sound of a croak, the other part of their name is either a reference to a young Yakuza subordinate leader or the head of an organizational section. There is likely a cultural reference here that I am sadly missing, as the only thing I can figure from this was that it was to make it clear that Frogadier are indeed a step up from Froakie and have some power to them, but is still capable of rising in the ranks and in turn evolving further, though I can also suppose that it might be a reference to their behavior as well, being bolder or more likely to cast stones than their pre-evolved form. Meowstic are an odd example when it comes to the Japanese names. While the reference to the word meow is pretty obvious, the other half, Onyx, seems a bit strange given their organic forms and the lack of actual rocky material in their bodies. While it is possible that the Greek word for claw would likely explain its inclusion, I also think that the term Onyx may refer to the unique color patterns seen in their fur, especially in the case of male Meowstic. Aegislash is noteworthy compared to its pre-evolved forms because its original name both references their power and capabilities and also an iconic figure that matches up well with it. First of all, its Japanese name can be potentially broken down into the words kill and guard, along with the Japanese word for to slay with a blade, more than attesting to the sheer power they have when in blade form. At the same time though, it is possible that its name may be a reference to Gilgamesh, an ancient hero of one, if not the oldest epic tale ever put into writing, clearly showing the societal power of these creatures and the link to both great royalty and great warriors in ancient times. Hawlucha has a bit of an odd structure to its original name that may be lost on me, as once again I do not understand the full meaning of this particular specimen. On the one hand, it is quite obvious that part of its original Japanese name contains part of the term lucha libre, which is the specific type of professional wrestling that these creatures are based on. However, contained within it is also the word bull, and given that Hawlucha is a bird, this feels like an odd inclusion to me, and is something I'd appreciate more enlightenment on if anyone is able to provide it as such. Trevenant's original Japanese name is a bit on the short side, but it does its job in giving a somewhat clear show of what these creatures are all about. The short bit for the word big is right there in front and center, but the rest of it basically translates to the word for rot. Together these are likely a direct reference to both their size and the fact that they are ghostly trees, hence the idea of rot and decay. Brionne stands out a bit from the rest of their family in terms of their Japanese name, as there is some unique meaning to its structure. Aside from the possible inclusion of the word marine, the name contains bits of Japanese words like ball, fashionable, and oddly enough, the word for a precocious young girl. I believe that these are all linked to their appearances, actions, and especially their skillful dancing abilities, as they are able to generate spheres of water as they dance, showing a degree of physical development and coordination that is remarkable at their young age, hence them being labeled as precocious. Gumshoes are a nice departure from the normally vicious natures of their pre-evolved form, and their patience in hunting for prey is a nice nod directly back to their original Japanese name. While the name clearly contains the word mongoose in it, it also has the Japanese word for detective in it as well. As mentioned, this is a direct reference to their patience in stalking their prey, much as a detective would take their time to assemble clues and information before going after a suspect for a crime. Salandit's name is a bit telling in regards to their behavior and the way they might survive in the wild. On the one hand, part of the name comes from the Japanese word for newt, which is a clear sign of the type of life form they are. However, the other half comes from the Japanese word for burglar, which might not make total sense at first, until one remembers that these creatures often spend most of their time gathering food for the salazzle that controls their groups. As such, this suggests that these creatures get most of their food resources from stealing from other organisms, a desperate move that clearly shows the dedication they have to taking care of their leaders, even at the expense of their own food resources and health. Beware have always been a bit of an odd creature when it comes to their appearances and the way they interact with others, but the original Japanese name really takes the cake when it comes to the way it is structured. Altogether, the name consists of 3 words that have been stitched together, the Japanese words for wearing, bear, and costume. I believe that this is a clever reference that goes back to their lives as Stuffle. While in that earlier stage, they resemble a plushie of some sort. In evolving though, they take on a physical form that looks a lot more human-like than you would expect for a normal bear, which might then mean that their name references the fact that they look more like someone in a giant bear costume than an actual bear. Orangaru's name is a nice nod to how they treat others, Pokemon and people alike, and a simple but clever way to also reference their overall intelligence. As one might expect, a large part of the original Japanese name means orangutan, which is what they are. However, the other part of their name means do it, which I think is a nod to both their signature instruct technique and the fact that they are intelligent enough to be able to order other people and Pokemon around, showing a command of both intelligence and communication that makes them more than stand out among Pokemon of any type. Palossand are tricky monsters to deal with in the real world and a threat worth avoiding at all costs, with their names being a clever indication that something isn't quite right with them. The name possibly contains derivatives from the Japanese words for sand and death, but it also certainly contains the phrase, "That's a castle, huh?" The first 2 bits are easily understood, but the inclusion of that specific phrase feels like a deadly nod to the fact that these creatures are able to easily disguise themselves as normal sand castles as they lie in wait for the next victim. The "huh" addition at the end is a feeling of nonchalant shrugging, someone just going with the fact that it's probably just a normal sandcastle, which is what Palossand hoped for, if only to lure them in close before attacking and killing their foolish prey. Tapu Koko of the 4 Guardian Land Spirits is an awkward one when it comes to its original Japanese name. While the first part in Hawaiian stands for something that is sacred or holy, which makes sense given its reverence in the Alola region, the second half of its name is derived from the Japanese term for cock-a-doodle-doo. That makes at least some sense because it does have a very rooster-like form, but it's still utterly hilarious to me at just how on the nose it sounds and feels, accurate as it is. Solgaleo, compared to Lunala, has a bit more going on with its name than might be present at first glance, and is a nice reference to one of the most famous astronomers to ever live. On the surface, it is quite apparent that its name contains the word Sol, the Latin root for sun, and Leo, a reference to its resemblance to a lion, but also Galileo, as in Galileo Galilei. The inclusion of this man's name into this creature is understandable when you look at his work, as he managed to find and present to the world clear evidence that the Earth rotated around the Sun, being an advocate for Copernican heliocentrism and thus cementing his association with the Sun. Nihilego are by far one of the creepier Ultra Beasts because of their form and behavior, and the way that they interact with and affect others is found right in the Japanese namesake. Their original name is partly derived from the Japanese or even English word for void, or even the suffix oid, which means of similar form. these are likely references to their otherworldly appearances and their capacity to make others feel like they are one of their own. This can also be made even more direct in meaning if the word id is included, which describes the instinctual component of one's personality from birth, and is a great reference to how Nihilego corrupt others by forcing them to embrace their most basic protective instincts in regards to how they treat Nihilego, forming a corrupted bond that helps to keep these creatures safe from attack. Celesteela has one of the nicest sounding names out of any Pokemon in my opinion, and the structure of its Japanese name is also a nifty nod to media outside of the Pokemon world. Celesteela's Japanese name has three components to it: the word for steel, which makes plenty of sense, gunfire, which is likely an indirect reference to their capacity to rocket off into open air and even space with their arms and body, and something a little less obvious, Princess Kaguya. The latter note references a monogatari, a fictional prose narrative called The Tale of the Bamboo Cutter, which sees the titular princess, who originally comes from the moon, being found as a baby inside the stalk of a growing bamboo plant. This is a wonderful reference not only to Celesteela's capacity to fly even through space, but also the fact that the creature's design is specifically meant to reference bamboo plants, bringing the reference full circle. Necrozma's name isn't that hard to dissect and understand, but I think that it is still worth noting here because it paints the creature in a fairly grim light. While it could have part of the Japanese word for black, more of its name is actually based in Greek, with the words for prism and dead contained within it. The latter word is the one of concern, as it highlights that, despite seemingly being quite active, in its normal state, Necrozma is actually broken or dead, and cannot come back to life truly unless its form is connected to an immense wellspring of energy, like when it bonds with Solgaleo or Lunala or enters its Ultra Necrozma form. Zeraora is a very unique case in this list, as the true origins and intentions in its Japanese name, which is the same as its English name, are not entirely certain. What can be said is that it seems that the name might have origins that span many different languages and meaning, ranging from a basis on Zeus, the Greek god of thunder and lightning, Ra, the sun god, as a nod towards Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, the Japanese word for tiger, Pharisee for thunder, Arabic for to beam, glitter, shine, or to encroach upon one's enemy, and so on and so forth. While this might make its name hard to translate, it nonetheless is an interesting situation that certainly makes Zeraora stand out from all the other creatures within this list. The members of the Sizzlipede family are a bit of an interesting note when it comes to their name, as it seems to suggest a level of power difference between the two evolutionary stages in said family. On the one hand, they both possibly contain the Japanese words for centipede or millipede, though which one it is specifically is hard to say. However, what makes the crucial difference is that Sizzlipede have the term for to burn in their name, whereas the evolved form Centiskorch have the term for completely burned instead. This may be a reference to the fact that their evolved forms are much stronger and able to make better use of their fiery attacks in battle, showing that they become more dangerous in name as well when they evolve. While Hatterene's name is quite self-explanatory with references to its Pokédex entries, its pre-evolutions in Hatenna and Hattrem are a bit more interesting. While both of their names have the word brim added on as a reference to the hat-like mat of hair that sits upon their heads, Hatenna also have the word for gesture, while Hattrem's original Japanese name has the word for hand gesture. This is likely a reference to their preference for silent communication, with the formers being the result of not having hands to directly gesture with, forcing them to use their body instead. Indeedee are well loved both in the real world and in the world of Pokemon for their appearances and mannerisms, and the original Japanese name reflects this greatly. For one thing, the name is a shortened version of the word yes sir, which is a nod towards them mainly acting as butlers and maids of a sort for other people in Pokemon. At the same time, the name also contains a reference to an honorific title, something that I believe clearly addresses the prim and proper manner in which they present themselves, which is quite adorable and makes it easy to feel affection towards these dutiful creatures. And lastly, while one might expect that legendary Pokemon, especially those of important standing in any given game, would have a name that directly references the power they have at their disposal, or at least hint towards the physical forms and even the lore behind their existence, this is not always the case. Oddly enough, Zacian and Zamazenta, the main mascots of Pokemon Sword and Shield, have names that are a lot less inspired. Translated from Japanese, Zacian is simply derived from the phrase the cyan, while Zamazenta comes from the magenta. This is both funny and a little awkward that the names merely reference their main body colors, but it doesn't take away from the fact that they still sound quite cool in their names, which are the same for most languages, so the odd origin of them can be forgiven for the most part.
And that covers the lot of it all. As you can now see, there is a lot of meaning behind the names of many types of Pokemon in their original language of choice, but this is only the tip of the iceberg. Pokemon has been translated into a number of languages aside from just English and Japanese, and many of them have their own stories to tell. Perhaps someday we'll take a close look at them as well, but for now, I hope that you enjoyed this lesson as a whole, and I look forward to seeing you all again here on the V.T.P. Thank you all for watching this video. It is always a pleasure to help teach others about the world of Pokemon and the many facets of it that exist in both the world we call home and the world they call home. If you'd like, please leave a comment and subscribe and ring the bell to this channel to get regular updates on content and anything else that might be going on. You can find me and my written work on DeviantArt under the name Untitled, and be informed of information and content uploads on my Twitter page and my Patreon page. Donations are always welcome. Always remember, the world of Pokemon is a vast and varied place, and there's no telling what secrets might be hiding just around the corner. So keep watch, stay vigilant, and always prepare for the unexpected. Until next time, have a wonderful rest of the day.